amount of time that he spent away from home had increased instead of decreasing. And the hours he'd kept had gotten later and later. When she questioned him about it, he always had an excuse, a story. Something always came up. There was always an emergency. And her issue was that he didn't have nearly as many emergencies before she'd been relegated to the house. This is Bedtime Stories, Grown-Up Edition, Irreconcilable Differences, Part 2. Anya completely ignored the flashing of the lights all throughout her house, but she was tapped into the argument that was going on her front porch. 2 weeks earlier, Anya K. St. James Hobbs and her husband Ronald Sr. welcomed their second child in under 3 years, a baby girl who they named River K. St. James Hobbs. They spent the last few months of Anya's pregnancy fighting like cats and dogs. And when River K was born, the fighting hadn't ended. They'd even fought over her name because Ron wanted to name their baby girl Ronisha. And he had the audacity to take exception to the fact that Anya wanted her daughter to have the last name St. James. Their son was a junior, so he couldn't have the hyphenated last name. But there was absolutely no reason why River K couldn't. When Anya and baby River K's hospital stay were up, they left the hospital with the mother's copy of the certification of birth, and the name that Anya had insisted on was printed on it. Because Anya and Ron were married, his signature was not required on the paperwork, and he didn't need to approve the name. Anya did try to get him to see things her way. She tried to come to a consensus with him. But like so many other things in their lives, he just wouldn't bend. For the first time, though, Anya had put her foot down because she'd really had enough of Ron's behind. When their first son was born, it was like pulling teeth to get him to participate in parenting. And Anya had been overwhelmed. She'd been working full-time at her mother's spa, Belle Dame, as the business manager. She'd been serving as the managing co-founder of the nonprofit organization she and her husband had founded to provide pro bono legal assistance to members of the deaf and hard of hearing community. Because Anya K had been born deaf. Her deafness was genetic, passed down through her mother's bloodline. Her Aunt Kay before her had been born deaf. She'd been born deaf. Her brother's daughter, Isla, had been born deaf. And it wasn't a surprise at all when her daughter, River Kay, was also born deaf. Having a deaf daughter shouldn't have been a difficulty for Ron, because he had a sister who was also born deaf. The way that he loved his baby sister and ensured that she had everything she needed to independently take care of herself and her own children was one of the main things that attracted Anya to Ron. She had no idea when she married that man and he begged her to have children with him that she was going to have to do most of the heavy lifting. When she'd had enough of doing all of the work, when their son was born, she was this close to walking away from her marriage if something didn't give. To save her marriage, she was willing to have her oldest brother, Q, have a conversation with her husband. But luckily, it didn't come to that. Ron had noticed that something was different, off, about his wife. And when she told him what the issue was, he'd made the adjustment. Anya had figured that whole difficulty was behind them. And having seen improvements in his behavior, she informed him that she was pregnant again. Yeah, when she first found out, she was hiding it from her husband. They lived in Texas, where deleted fetus was illegal. And most states required that a married woman seeking to delete a fetus have the signature of her husband on the paperwork. When she was 12 years old, she'd been assaulted, and that assault had resulted in a pregnancy. Her parents had sent her to Trinidad, their home country. And while she was there, her aunt, Jera Baptiste, called in a medicine doctor who'd given Anya bush medicine to delete the fetus. And Anya almost lost her life and her ability to reproduce. So she'd been against using that option. But facing a fourth pregnancy so soon after she'd had her first son, her concerns about whether her husband would support her, and concerns that if she gave birth to a baby girl, that baby girl would also be born deaf, coupled with her limited options for deleting a fetus, had her on the verge of reconsidering that as an option. Thankfully, though, she hadn't gone that route. Her second pregnancy had been a breeze, and the delivery was pretty easy. Holding her 2-week-old baby girl was one of the most fulfilling experiences she'd ever had in her life. The only problem was she was done with her damn husband. Because shortly after she learned that she was pregnant and she told her husband about the pregnancy, her entire family had been under attack. An international trafficking organization had waged war against the Notorious Five Families, two of which were the Baptiste and St. James families. Her families. Anya was a part of the family that was not involved in criminal activity. She was a legitimate businesswoman, a wife, and mother. But the International Trafficking Organization hadn't been all that selective about who they attacked during the ongoing war. They were traffickers. So they'd made a business of going after those they saw as weak and vulnerable. Women and children were obviously not off limits, and being deaf made her even more vulnerable. As a result, Anya had to do all of her work from home. Additional assistants had to be hired at Bedtime and at the nonprofit organization, because Anya was unable to go into either facility, even with the mounds of security that were at her disposal. When the order came down that everyone in the family needed to adjust how they moved, Anya was definitely not pleased. Her husband, Ron, though, had no issue with his wife being relegated to the family complex in Denton, Texas. He'd somehow missed the memo, though, that the same way Anya had to restrict how she moved, so did he. Anya couldn't understand why, because she was present when her mother, Bella Baptiste St. James, also known as the Queen Mother, who was the queen pin at the helm of the Baptiste family, told her husband in no uncertain terms that he needed to pass off as many cases as he could at his law firm, Hobbs and Associates, as well as at their nonprofit organization. According to Ron, though, business was booming. His partners at his law firm already had heavy caseloads, and the other lawyers who they'd gotten to provide legal services pro bono for the nonprofit were already carrying the maximum number of cases that they could actually service, while simultaneously providing paid legal services at their own firms. It seemed like every time Anya looked around, Ron had found a reason why he needed to leave the family complex. And when he was gone for hours. He'd always claimed that he was trying to maximize his time out in the world. But Anya was extremely frustrated by the fact that the amount of time that he spent away from home had increased instead of decreasing. And the hours he'd kept had gotten later and later. When she questioned him about it, he always had an excuse, a story. Something always came up. There was always an emergency. And her issue was that he didn't have nearly as many emergencies before she'd been relegated to the house. And the time that he spent away from home put the burden of responsibility for caring for their son right back in her lap. RJ had turned 2 years old while she was pregnant with River K, and he was absolutely in the terrible twos. During the daytime, she had help. There was a de facto daycare being run right there on the property. The grandmother crew, which included Regina's mother, Mom Joyce, her sister-in-law Angela's mother-in-law from her previous marriage, Mom Brenda, and Miss Bernie, the aunt of her brother Donovan's daughter, Bella. Because there was a war going on, the grandmother crew brought in reinforcements. Her cousin Salima's mother-in-law, Mrs. Ali, and one of her Uncle Nigel's triplet daughters, Chantal. Since the changes had been made, Miss Bernie had been unalived. She'd participated in one of the family's operations, Operation Reborn, in an effort to protect all of the children, after she'd been caught slipping when she'd gone off the complex for a spa day so that she and Mrs. Ali could get on the same page. And later that evening, when she was supposed to meet Mrs. Ali at a blues club that she'd been able to safely frequent up until that point, she'd been assaulted. Her phone had been compromised, and the mercenaries behind her assault had given her an ultimatum. Thankfully, Miss Bernie had learned her lesson after several situations where she'd made choices that put other members of the family in danger. She'd immediately told Angela and the Queen Mother everything. And when they stepped in to assist her, she'd adamantly refused to not be included in the plan. In an attempt to save the day, she went off script, and in the end, she was successful, but she forfeited her own life in the process. So the grandmother crew was less one grandmother, and all of the mothers of the children that they kept during the daytime were filling in to take up the slack 1 week at a time. Everyone except for her cousin Salima, who'd given birth prematurely to her own daughter and didn't have any other children. That meant that 1 week out of every month, and sometimes two, Anya helped with the children during the daytime and did her work for Beldam and the nonprofit in the evening. With Ron MIA, she had to do both of those jobs and care for their son. When she complained about it, he suggested that she ask one of the mothers in the grandmother crew if they'd be willing to help her out, just until RJ went to bed each night. And being completely overwhelmed, Eventually, she swallowed her pride and did just that. But Anya was a very private person who hated for people to be involved in her personal business and really hated for anybody to see her as inept, as weak, vulnerable, requiring assistance because she had a disability. Her parents and her siblings had never coddled her. She'd always been empowered to do what needed to be done for herself. And she took pride in the fact that her mother had allowed her to not only serve as the business manager for Bedtime, but to be the face of her brand. She knew that if her mother wasn't involved in the ongoing war, she would have been right by her side. And if her father, Pops Andy, was still alive, he would have been a hands-on grandfather for her son, just like he'd been for his other grandchildren. She'd also wanted to protect her husband's reputation. The last thing she needed was for the men in her family to find out that her husband had dropped the ball again. Because while he was the fraternity brother of her oldest brother Q and one of his closest friends, even her brother Q, who was the more level-headed of her brothers, would have got all up in his behind his baby sister and his nephew. And her older brother Donovan, the middle child, was absolutely nuts. And that's not a dig at the fact that Donovan is mentally ill, even medicated and in therapy, and having found Christ, serving as a minister of the gospel at the Salvation Center of Dallas. That man could still go from 0 to 100 real quick. And the last thing she needed was for either of her brothers to break off foot in her husband's behind. That wasn't going to make her marriage better. But as she sat there holding a 2-week-old River K, RJ insistently tapped on her leg. He figured that his mother didn't see the lights flashing, indicating that someone was at the door. She quickly signed to him that she was aware and that she wasn't going to the door. RJ had no clue that his father was on the other side of that door, and he couldn't get in the house because his mother had changed the locks and the code. Anya was watching the doorbell camera, reading the words that were being transcribed on the screen that were a result of her husband's ongoing conversation with the soldier who was stationed at their front door. He was demanding that the soldier let him in, and the soldier was explaining to him that he couldn't. All of the soldiers assigned to the Hobbs household had been informed by Anya that Ron was not to be let in. The soldiers did not have free reign to enter any of the homes on the family complex. Those assigned to the Hobbs household had access to 2 codes. The emergency code that all of the soldiers had access to, when entered in any of the homes on the property, would immediately alert every soldier, every lieutenant, and every general associated with the Lopez, St. James, or Baptiste family. Entering that code meant that there was a red alert. There was an emergency for which backup was required, and it was an all-hands-on-deck situation. The soldiers assigned to the Hobbs household had the additional code that they were allowed to use only when they had permission from Anya or Ron to enter their locked home. And while Ron was the head of his household, Anya was a Baptiste and a St. James. And since her family was paying their salaries, she was in a position to overrule any instructions that Ron gave. And baby, Ron was pissed. He was giving the soldier hell. And seeing that he was getting nowhere, he demanded that the soldier call his lieutenant. The lieutenant was on the phone, and he was telling Ron that he needed to find someplace else to go. Because unless he heard directly from Anya or from his general, Ron was not getting in his own house. He didn't give a damn that he paid for it. He didn't care how mad he was that his 2 children were inside. And if he carried out his threat to break a window, the soldier would take him down and hold him until one of Anya's big brothers showed up. And Ron ain't want them problems. He didn't want them in his business, and he already knew what it was. Neither Donovan nor Q would help him get into his house. And while Q wasn't likely to put hands on him, he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Donovan wouldn't hesitate. So he gave up on his attempts to get in and sent his wife a strongly worded text message as he slunk back to his vehicle and drove back off the property. He was glad to see that security were in tow, which meant that maybe all wasn't lost. But when he read his wife's responding text message, he realized that things were a lot worse than he'd assumed. Ron had done his best to stay close to home in the days leading up to Anya's delivery of their daughter. And he was right there when his baby girl was born and by Anya's side the following days after she was released from the hospital. He did as much work as he could from his home office. And while he wasn't 100% honest about what he'd been doing, he had good reason. For years, he tried his best to get in with the 5 families. He wanted to provide them with legal representation. He knew they paid handsomely, and he wanted in. Anya had been adamantly against it. But since the day he'd met Catherine St. James, the wife of Anya's deceased uncle Nigel St. James, the former kingpin of the St. James criminal organization, he'd been up to his ears in work. They'd had him working at a federal level. Before he and Anya had undergone the endeavor to begin their nonprofit, he'd had no reason to sit for the bar, for the U.S. District Court, the Circuit Court of Appeals, or the Supreme Court, all of which was mandatory for a lawyer to handle cases in those courts. Not only was there an exorbitant expense, but it required hours of training, mentorship with other lawyers who'd already passed the bar for those 3 levels of justice. He was already licensed to practice law in Texas and Louisiana. So in order to support members of the deaf and hard of hearing community with federal criminal cases, he'd had to fulfill those requirements and put in all that work to do so. His wife had had no issue with that. The problem came in when he took federal criminal cases through Hobbs and Associates. She had no idea about that work. She also had no idea that he'd stopped taking local cases in Texas and Louisiana. He'd spent the last few years of his professional career working with the Notorious Five Families network of lawyers. And while he was still a trial attorney, the work he did for the Five Families was sending him all around the country, not to handle federal trials, but managing individuals in federal custody, negotiating with the federal government outside of the courtroom, and creating avenues by which employees of one of the Five Families or allies and associates of the organization could continue or further their criminal activity from inside. His training was not limited to preparation for the bar or learning federal court procedures. He'd also been learning code so that he could pass coded messages between his clients in federal custody and their handlers in the respective organizations on the outside. Most recently, he'd been responsible for managing the federal detention of one St. Artemis Montclair, the second-born son of Nigel St. James, a finisher for the St. James organization. And doing so required that he fly to New York, D.C., Maryland, and Arkansas, all under Anya's nose. Lying to his wife had been easy, because he'd been doing that for years. Telling lies that were believable had become a whole lot harder once she got pregnant with their second child. Up until that point, she'd been down for whatever. Rarely, if ever, even questioned him. She'd been busy and focused on her own stuff and taking care of their son, RJ. When she made waves about how little he participated in the parenting, he'd stepped his game up, put in more effort, and shifted a few things around within the Five Families network of attorneys. He hadn't been a part of the team long enough to actually be calling shots. But since Catherine was well aware of the fact that he was doing all of this behind his wife's back, and she'd had no problem helping him keep it from her, she'd been willing to help lift his load. She'd also given him some real talk. Catherine had told Ron that he needed to make sure he was taking care of home, that in order to keep something like this from his wife long term, he couldn't afford to have any other deceptions. When he wasn't working, he needed to be a family man. And he also needed to ensure that no matter what he did or how he did it, it did not end up on the Queen Mother's radar. Anya's mother was the queenpin of the Baptiste family, and she didn't play about her baby girl. She would have no problem with him representing the family. She absolutely would have a problem with him doing so against Anya's wishes and without her knowledge. Yeah, he was a lawyer, but he was committing crimes. Aiding and abetting a felon could wind him up in federal prison. And if that was a risk he was willing to take, then his wife deserved to know about it. And since that wasn't going to happen, it was a good thing that the only people who knew who a detainee's legal representation was that detainee's handler and the individual responsible for cutting the check. Like all other things in the Notorious Five Families, information was provided on a need-to-know basis. And the identity of a detainee's lawyer wasn't something that most people needed to know. You would think that with her brother being the kingpin of the St. James organization, that Q would have been informed. Or at the very least, he would have checked the file to find out who was representing his cousin Saint. But like most things in the Five Families, there was a delegation of authority. And that particular area of the organization was under Catherine's jurisdiction. Not to mention, Q was a little busy. He was dealing with the ongoing war with the International Trafficking Organization. In the same way that Ron didn't know all the ins and outs of what his friend, frat brother, and brother-in-law Q was doing, Q didn't know all the ins and outs of what Ron was doing either. When he'd approached Q several years before about pursuing a relationship with his sister, Q had made it clear that she was capable of making her own decisions, and he wasn't the man whose permission he needed. He'd been pleased when his sister found love with one of his closest friends. He was confident that his friend would be able to provide his sister with the protection and provision that she needed. When the two eloped, the entire family was shocked. Pops Andy was heartbroken that he didn't get to walk his only baby girl down the aisle. And the Queen Mother was ready to rip his damn head off, because she knew there had to be a terrible reason why her daughter would make that decision. And she'd been right. The two had already been planning to marry, but it happened so suddenly because Anya had found herself in a pickle. Ron had helped her with that pickle. And in order to ensure that he wouldn't be compelled to testify against her, he needed to be her husband. It didn't take long for Q to find out exactly what the circumstances were that necessitated their elopement. And what started as anger quickly became appreciation. Anya came from a family that respected a person being 10 toes in one way behind a member of the family. And Ron was not the only one who'd made a serious decision in order to protect Anya. While the newlyweds had their heads on a swivel, Donovan had been covering Anya's 6. He'd made a nigga disappear and ensured that the heat was completely off his baby sister. With that monkey off their backs, they were able to enjoy their new lives together. Right up until Anya found out that she was pregnant, and she didn't know who the daddy was, because she'd been SA'd by the older brother of the man who'd SA'd her when she was 12 years old. He'd come and found her in Texas and did everything in his power to make her life a living hell. And while she didn't fight back when she was 12 years old, she'd fought back that time. She thought she'd unalived that man. She was shocked and relieved to discover that her brother did. The next few years of their marriage had been drama-free. Anya had to get over the passing of Pops Andy, and they'd had to become accustomed to being new parents. Anybody looking in from the outside would have assumed that their marriage was healthy and whole. Anya had been under the same impression until recently. And Ron had done everything he could to keep her in the dark about his business choices and his personal ones. But the text message that she sent him made it clear that his efforts to keep her in the dark had failed somewhere. Before the couple had moved into the family complex in Denton a few years earlier, they lived in the house that Ron had already owned. Anya's responding text didn't address any of the things that Ron had said in his. Nothing except the part about his belongings. Anya's response said, "Everything you own has been packed up and delivered to your other house. Now you won't have to make it look like you live there, because you really do."
I was quiet because God was building a case. Now I'm free, and you still got a face. The seals are breaking, truth is revealed. Nothing hidden that won't be unsealed. You thought my exit was emotional rage, but God called me out before vengeance engaged. For vengeance is mine,